that the Saudis have also supported humanitarian interventions through local NGOs in Sada quite recently. That has also been reported, but also witnessed by our humanitarian colleagues there, and also previously in Taiz as well. So, yeah, I think that there is, in the totality of our endeavour, there is an awareness that aid has to meet all of the people, irrespective of what part of the country they're in, whose control that they're under, and that is also why we accepted the Saudi funding for the flash appeal last year with no strings attached, because we decided in the United Nations where that aid would go, and without any influence over who was in control of the particular areas. So yeah, I think we're all very conscious to make sure that the country is covered. It's obvious that this is covering, this particular convoy of support is going to a particular area, and what we have to make sure in the overall coordination is that all areas continue to be covered.
Okay, and then Mr. Abadi.
Thank you. My name is Emoke Babiak. I'm with the German press agency. I'd actually also like to ask you about the World Humanitarian Summit. I mean, you see the funding appeal is 17% funded. So are you optimistic that next week the summit will somehow deliver a big change in that? And also, what would need to change? What would countries and donors need to agree to change for you to see a real impact and difference on the ground?
Yeah. We are very hopeful. That's why we were very pleased that the Secretary General took this as a very important initiative during the second term of his tenure, because there's obviously a deficit of humanity in the world today. I mean, that's the core issue here. It's not in the first instance a deficit of funding; it's a deficit of humanity, which is translating into horrific loss of life, horrific suffering across the world, much of it the result of man-made conflict that is preventable and endable. But also we have to be aware that the natural disaster phenomenon is having greater and greater impact in terms of human consequence as well, because we're seeing natural disasters which are much more devastating, particularly when we look at the typhoons and monsoons and so forth, but also the recent earthquakes as well. So the World Humanitarian Summit is a moment of reflection at the end of a 3-year process where there was a mobilization across the globe which involved over 25,000 people in a movement to refocus us on humanity and our responsibility to humanity. And what does that translate into? It translates into, hopefully, at the highest level, and that's why it's called a summit, at the highest level, a political reflection that political leaders can and must do better. Okay? The Secretary General has set out an agenda for humanity, which is published in his report, which again was the product of all of these multi-stakeholder consultations. It set out very clearly what he means by an agenda of humanity in some detail, and what it is that we should be doing globally to do better, and how that will benefit the whole world. I mean, that's what this is about. Istanbul is the event where we're looking forward to global leadership, not just political, but also it's a multi-stakeholder event, so it's a huge event that will have over 6,000 participants. It's the first time ever. It's once in a generation, we would say. We will not be having an annual event. It is truly a moment to put us on a new track. And what we're hopeful of is that, yes, that all levels, but starting at the top, will re-engage in a much more active way on this agenda for humanity, which means, in the first instance, upholding international humanitarian law, intervening to end and prevent conflict. Yes, stepping up with the resources, which in global terms are very meager, but they are serious resources. $20 billion US dollars for humanitarian action is indeed a lot of money, but when you put it in the global context of trillions being spent on various other international activities, it is relatively modest. So again, we hope that at the global leadership level, they will reflect on their capacity to do much better in the humanitarian agenda, and also in furthering a much better agenda for humanity, which will benefit all of us, because at the heart of all of this is our civilized existence, which is rooted in peace, security, stability, development, the welfare. Wherever there is injustice, then the injustice also affects the stability and security and so forth. So it's a large agenda in some respects. It's not a new agenda. We're not looking for new human rights commitments or international humanitarian law commitments, or we're just looking for a new energy, a new engagement, a new commitment to live up to those responsibilities, and a realization, of course, that in the end all of this is in our collective self-interest, that we do much better than we're currently doing, because the trajectory is a very negative trajectory if one looks back over the last number of years and decades, when one sees the level of increase in human suffering and unnecessary human loss of life and so forth. So we have, I think, a lot of ambition for this summit, and we see it also as a launching point for doing much better at all levels. So humanitarian organizations, you're talking about governments, of course, but also other stakeholders who can contribute, that we really come to a better place. And that at the end of the day, or the 2 days, that people who are suffering out there in these various countries, that they will feel a positive effect. I mean, that will be the true test of the summit itself. Obviously, they will be hopeful that with such a gathering, with such a focus, that it will translate into real and meaningful action. I would say that there's a lot of optimism around that, and that is hopeful. But of course, the proof will be in the impact, and that's what we also want to focus on. We want to keep it very concrete and very practical. And as I say, it's not about setting out new lofty ideals or ideas. It's about really a much better and more practical engagement that will result in the reduction of humanitarian suffering, and an increase in an agenda for humanity which will make it a better place. And that we see that, yeah, Istanbul is then the beginning of an improvement, as opposed to another, marker on a trajectory that has been negative for quite a long time.
Mr. Abadi.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Director King, for this briefing. You very ably described the lamentable and serious and grave situation, humanitarian situation in Yemen, particularly concerning children. And you also mentioned briefly the involvement of specialized agencies whose staff are very dedicated in that area. What is the significance of the role of UNICEF in Yemen?
UNICEF is one of the biggest humanitarian organizations in Yemen. They have a huge portfolio, as you might expect, because children are a particularly vulnerable group. I mean, half of Yemen's population are youth and children. UNICEF have a very large portfolio of programming, obviously looking at the nutritional status of children and addressing that. I've already mentioned the problems and challenges there. They also have a big program on water and sanitation. They also have a big program supporting the Ministry of Education, and also the whole question of education in conflict is a big issue for them. Trauma for children that are affected by the environment, psychosocial issues there. And they are a long-standing agency in terms of their engagement in Yemen. So their engagement in Yemen predates this particular crisis and goes back many, many years. So they have a very large network of national partners and also working with international NGOs. They have been also part of an international endeavour to bring large supplies in to Yemen because of the difficulty with access. So they've been very active on that as well. So playing a very big and a very important role, and I do commend the dedication of their staff because they are very present, and particularly the national staff, not just of UNICEF but also of UN and other international organizations who are the backbone always in these crisis situations.
Thank you. My name is Mustafa Keleş from Turkish Anadolu Agency. Mr. Ging, you mentioned about the security and the access problem in many parts of Yemen for the humanitarian. Can you elaborate about that? Which part has this problem is mostly, and do you think the airdrop would be an option for these parts of the Yemen? Thank you.
The access in Yemen is most difficult in the areas which are actually caught up in conflict itself. So the places that you find the most intense conflict are the places where we struggle to gain access. You know, we have a very dedicated team there. People are putting their lives on the line to actually get access. Whenever we are you know, reminded through the loss of life of the dangers, I mean, this is of course very humbling. As in any crisis zone, we look at all the options. Airdrops have not been on the agenda as a last resort yet in Yemen, because we have found other ways of getting the supplies in, and we will continue to you know, do whatever we need to do. As I said, we are very focused on access as the number one issue when we talk to those who are involved in the conflict, to let us get where we need to be, and we have very dedicated and courageous staff to get out there. So that is this current status. At the moment, airdrops are not on our agenda at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Ging. When it comes to UNVIM, this verification and inspection mechanism, what's the status? It is fully operational. Do we have any problems with getting anything in the country? Because there were reports that there are obstacles from the coalition. Thank you.
Yeah, so the access by sea of supplies to Yemen is in two parts. One is the humanitarian supplies, and this is very much dealt with by the United Nations itself. Humanitarian organizations, we have a mechanism there for the smooth passage and fast passage of humanitarian supplies. So if something is designated for a humanitarian organization as humanitarian supplies, then that follows a certain procedure, and that has worked very well over the period of the conflict. Then when it comes to commercial shipping, so this is outside of the humanitarian supplies purchased by humanitarian organizations provided to them as donations. This is the commercial shipping that brings in fuel, that brings in all the other foodstuffs and other, you know, supplies that people need to live their lives. As you know, Yemen is very dependent on imports. This has been something that has been problematic, because there is a restriction imposed on commercial shipping under UN resolution around the whole question of ensuring that arms and other weapons, ammunition and supplies are not coming in. So that whole endeavour of ensuring that the supplies coming into Yemen complied with those restrictions led to the establishment of a UN verification and inspection mission. Now that mission is now up and running, so it is fully operational, just recently actually, and all commercial shipping then have to notify this UN-led mechanism. It's not a humanitarian instrument. It's separate, but it is very important to us in the humanitarian community that it functions. And that mechanism is notified by commercial shippers of their intention to supply Yemeni, to enter Yemeni waters and offload in Yemeni ports. And then that verification and inspection mission will ensure that those ships are actually complying with the restrictions and give the clearances. And so far that mechanism has been working well in terms of their own functioning. They have a 48-hour turnover period in terms of doing their job, which may, if they decide, involve also inspecting the ships, and that whole procedure has been worked out. So it's now up and running. What we're waiting to see is what will its positive effect be, and we should be able to see that in the coming weeks. We look forward to that. The idea is that this will speed up the passage of commercial supplies into Yemen, and that's desperately needed.
Carol, then we'll take the last question in the back.
Just concerning the Yemen appeal and the Saudi contribution, which wasn't renewed, I was wondering if there was any discussion with the Saudis about leaving that $245 million hole, and also discussions with other Gulf countries about funding. And given the complications with the Saudi funding, was it felt that perhaps they shouldn't be involved in that aspect?
Yeah, so there were sensitivities obviously about Saudi funding, which have been well documented in terms of how do you ensure that a party to the conflict, that the funding that it provides for humanitarian action is in compliance with humanitarian principles in terms of independence, impartiality and so forth. And we ensured that by accepting it with no strings attached. Just as we have accepted funding from other member states who've been involved in conflict, whether in Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever, on the same basis, that the funding provided for humanitarian action is provided in accordance with humanitarian principles, and therefore it comes with no strings attached. Saudi Arabia complied with those conditions. So they provided the funding to United Nations organizations in accordance with the allocation that was decided by the United Nations coordinator and in accordance with United Nations programs that had been pre-proposed as opposed to negotiated. So again, there was sensitivity and those sensitivities were addressed in a way that meets international norms and standards for such contributions. That was last year. This year, we have not received a new or additional allocation from Saudi Arabia or from any of the other Gulf countries for that matter. So therefore, yes, we are, of course, seeking support from all member states in accordance with humanitarian principles. We seek their funding to the multilateral system with no strings attached, and we are reaching out to not just Gulf countries but many other countries who are having resources that could possibly be helpful to us in this response.
Last question.
Thank you. You said that the funding deficit amounts to 50%, a union gap with the implications thereof. So instead of leaving the issue to the donors' conscience, What can and should the UN and other bodies do to get countries and donors in general contribute and donate more generously? Thank you.
Yeah, this is the dilemma that we've had for the last couple of years. In fact, for many years, is the big gap between what we put out as our international appeals based on what are international norms and standards of responding. I mean, they're basic, very basic commitments that have been made around the provision of health care, basic medicines, vaccines for children, very basic shelter kits and food parcels. I mean, this is our global commitment to help people who are in humanitarian distress, who are dependent on international humanitarian response. And globally, we are not, in the countries who have the means, we are not living up to that responsibility for the people who don't have the means in a given circumstance. And I often remind people, for example, that in the case of the Syrian people, okay, this was one of the most generous countries when it came to hosting refugees for many, many decades. Before this crisis in Syria, there were over 6 million refugees in Syria. And the standard of support that they received in terms of international standards was absolutely top class. They were given full socioeconomic rights to employment and so forth. They were integrated into the communities and so on. And this was the Syrian culture, the Syrian people. Away from politics, this is what now, of course, Syrian people themselves in their hour of need, okay, that we're not able to meet their very basic needs to the point that they are so despairing of their plight in the neighbouring countries that they embark on these perilous journeys to Europe and elsewhere. We have to hope that there will be a moment of reflection on the degree of failure at the highest political level. And when one puts the amount of money into global context, for example, the amount of money that is spent globally on the international military, which is declared, and you can go and see it on the websites, at 17.6 trillion United States dollars, it's 2.3% of global GDP. We asked for 0.7% of GNI for all of the overseas development aid, so development and humanitarian. Were we to get 0.7% of GNI from the rich countries, from the OECD countries, we would have over 158 billion extra dollars available for development assistance, of which 10 to 15% would be normally allotted to humanitarian action. And the maths are very simple. We'll take the 10%, because that would be 15 billion. That would be more than the deficit that we have for humanitarian action. Like, countries have made these commitments. They know that this is what should be done, but they don't live up to these commitments. And then the consequence is that innocent people are suffering needlessly. It's not that the money isn't available, because if you were to take 0.5% of the global spend on military and give that to humanitarian action, that would be the end of our deficit. My question that I would like answered by global leaders is, what do you think the difference would be to our world today if you were to take 0.5% from global military spend in terms of the negative impact that that would cause versus the positive impact that's saving all these lives over here on the humanitarian side by using that money? These are the choices that are being made, because the decision that is made is put the money where it is and leave the deficit where it is. We want a new approach to this which thinks about the consequences, because it's not that the world doesn't have the money available, it's not making the right decisions about where it sends the money that is available. Global banks, and this would be my final point, global banks are fined billions of dollars for malpractice every year. Where does that money go? So before we talk about increasing taxes on already, overtaxed taxpayers across the world for humanitarian action, let us look at other sources of money, such as the fines on commercial banks, for example, who, again, have nothing to do with taxing people, but it's a windfall income. Where does that go? Why can't that be channeled into international humanitarian action? Where does it go? So we'd like answers to these questions. It's not that there isn't money out there. There's lots of money out there. Billions and billions and billions, but it's not being prioritized for international humanitarian action. And that's where our humanity starts, across the world. People in Yemen, they could not understand, when I was meeting with them, they could not understand why they are abandoned to this plight in a rich world. What is it? Where is the humanity? Many people ask me, where is the humanity? And the answer is, it's not there for them right now. And that is not acceptable. And again, in terms of international obligations and commitments that have been in this institution elaborated and recited year after year, we have to find a way to translate those commitments and the responsibilities behind them into more effective action for people. And that's why the Secretary-General has elaborated this very straightforward agenda for humanity. It's at the core of our civilized existence. And the way things are in the world today, we cannot hold our heads up with any pride when we see such devastating consequences for so many people across the world. And surely we know we can absolutely do better. And that's why we're addressing the people with the power to do better. Thank you.
John, thank you very much.